The presentation today is brought to you by our Masters of Science in Drug Development and Product Management team. One housekeeping thing, if you want to turn on your chat, the way we're going to take questions is that just chat as we go along, enter some questions, and then we'll come back at the end of the time and address the questions. So with that, I think I'm going to get started. Williams, you want to go to the next slide? Just to give you a little bit of background, so this, the three of us, that's Williams, right there at the beginning. You'll hear from him in a moment. I'm there in the middle. I'm the faculty director of the MS program in Drug Development and Product Management. And we also have on our management team is Jeremiah Momper, and he's more of our regulatory expert, but cannot be here with us today. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to Williams. He's our managing director of our MS program, and he's going to give us our presentation. So enjoy and use the chat for questions.
Thank you, Jan. Welcome, everyone. Again, thank you for being with us today. And please don't hesitate to ask questions. I understand this is not going to be interactive at the beginning, but if you type your questions in chat, we'll try to answer most of them towards the end of the presentation. So what I'd like to do today is kind of give you a brief overview of the pharma and biotech landscape, of what happened in 2017, and also over the first few months of 2018. So the objectives of this brief lecture, or talk, I should say, is to give you an understanding of the biopharmaceutical R&D ecosystem, as well as covering what happened last year with the new administration, some of the disruptive, innovative treatments that were launched, as well as what happened with regulatory and drug approval in the US, and a few marketing and pricing issues. I will also cover the disruption that is probably going to happen in 2018, as you will see. So just briefly, for those of you who don't have a biopharmaceutical background and have not worked in the pharmaceutical or biotech industry, this is just a brief illustration to show all the people and that are involved into drug development and product management and research. So you have startups, you have academic research institutions, the patent office is very involved, finance is involved, you have nonprofit organizations that get involved as well. Obviously, you have a big regulatory commission like the FDA, clinical trials, biopharmaceutical research companies, clinical research organizations. So as you can see, I mean, this is extremely diverse group of people and organizations. And all of these people have one goal in common, and that is to bring to patients new medicine that will hopefully improve the healthcare of everyone. So just to cover briefly what the phases of drug discovery and development are, you start in basic research with novel biology. Usually you have a novel target against which you think it has an implication in the disease. You start then screening compound, either small molecule or biologics. You then move that towards the process of preclinical, which includes usually in vitro and in vivo assays in animal most of the time, which is required by the FDA. The FDA requires about 2 animal models. And then you file an IND, which is a new drug applications, that basically allows you to go into clinical development in humans. The phases are phase 1, which is usually in healthy volunteer, except for oncology, where we start in patients. Then go into phase 2, which is really trying to determine the appropriate dose, and we look at that stage a little bit also what happened on the safety. Actually, phase 1 is primarily for safety. And then phase 3 is to demonstrate efficacy and also look at major potential side effect, because the number, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, increased from 10 to hundreds to thousands of people, depending on the indication you are trying to get your product approved. You then submit an NDA with the FDA or the EMA or the Japanese Ministry of Health. And once the FDA or EMA approve your drug, you then go into other stages, which is phase 4. Again, this actually has many variations, but I don't have a lot of time to go through that right now. It will definitely be covered in a lot more detail towards the, if you are a student of the master's degree. So let me cover the pharmaceutical and biotech landscape. So first of all, one other thing that's absolutely essential is that, as you know, this is an industry that is extremely regulated. And with the new administration, President Trump appointed Scott Gottlieb, the commissioner for the US FDA, which is going to make and has already started to make some changes within the system of the agency, as well as having additional scrutiny of prices. To be honest, for a long time, FDA was really never involved in pricing, and I don't think they will be, but this is something that people are going to start to look at much more closely. The other thing that is going to have an impact on R&D for the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, as well as many other industries, is the fact that the new corporate tax law that just passed potentially will help companies to bring money back in and reinvest in R&D from the perspective of getting new drugs into the pipeline, and obviously also new jobs, hopefully here in the US. So let's talk about regulatory issues. Just to give you an idea, this is just a brief chart that goes back from 2008. It's actually, most of these slides have actually references, and I'm not sure if we'll be able to provide you these slides or not, but if you'd like them, send an email to Shannon and we will email that to you. This shows basically the number of drugs that have been approved since 2008 by the FDA. Which is quite interesting because if you look at the numbers, 2017 was actually a stellar year. And let's hope that it continues on that path. What does this mean? That means that, and this is basically for new drug application. It's not for necessarily generics. Okay, this only is for a new drug application because generics go through a different process. So this demonstrates really high productivity from the agency, as well as from the industry in terms of launching a number of new drugs. If we look at that number a bit more in detail for 2017, 33% of these drugs were first in class. What this means is that they were the first against the indication that they filed. And that's very, very important because this is truly what I call either disruptive innovation or changing innovation in the sense that nothing existed against those targets or for that specific indication. What is also important is to note that 18 of the 46 drugs that were approved last year were approved to treat rare orphan diseases. Orphan disease is defined by the FDA as a disease that affects less than 200,000 Americans. For example, hemophilia A, multiple sclerosis, ALS, acute myeloid leukemia, and many others. And that's quite important because usually you get very often an accelerated approval and sometimes also breakthrough approval, which are all basically done from the agency to accelerate the timeline as to the clinical trial as well as the review process from the agency, which can be very short, sometimes less than 6 months. With that, one thing that is also really important to address is the fact that the FDA has approved a number of new products, actually 9 to be exact, biosimilars. And biosimilars are basically what one could call a generic of a biologic. And this is really important because the US has been really behind the rest of the world, especially Europe or India and China and other places, in the sense that up until recently last year, there was no biosimilar in the market, in the US market. And this will have a really great impact on accessibility, meaning that more patients will be able to benefit from biosimilars. And also it will have an impact on the pricing as well, as these are somewhat generic. Again, I don't want to call them completely generic because you still have to do clinical trial to demonstrate efficacy and safety, whereas for a true generic on small molecule, you don't have to do that. So anyway, if this is something of interest, again, this will be actually taught in the MS in great detail. We have a course in biologics and biosimilars that will be taught by Dr. Joseph Ma and Dr. Hubert Chen. Let's talk about what happened in 2017 in terms of disruptive innovation. So one of the things that has been really important is the 21st Century Cure Act, which was introduced for regenerative therapies. And what is regenerative therapies? It's basically a cell therapy, a therapeutic tissue engineering product, a human cell and tissue product, or any combination product using such therapy or product. These are definitions from the FDA, which is intended to treat, modify, reverse, or cure serious life-threatening disease. More importantly, it has the potential to address major unmet medical needs, for such disease or condition which there is no treatment currently. And that's really important. In March 2017, the FDA granted the first RMAT designation to Humacil, a first-in-class human cellular vessel in phase 2 for peripheral vascular disease. Another thing that was approved in 2017 by the FDA is a first-in-class Kymriah, which is actually Novartis CAR T cell therapy. And I'll spend a little bit more time to explain how this is done with the next slide. But basically, CAR T cell immunotherapy are created by injecting an individual T cell with DNA that encode a chimeric antigen receptor. That's where the CAR comes from, the chimeric antigen receptor. As I mentioned, in August 2017, Kymriah was approved for patients up to 25 years of age with B-cell precursor acute lymphoblastic leukemia that is refractory or in second or later relapse. 83% of the patients that were treated, as you can see, this was a small trial, and for this indication, that's what was basically what was needed, were in overall remission rate in this patient population. So really, really high efficacy. In October 2017, another CAR T cell therapy was approved by the FDA for the treatment of adult patients with relapsed or refractory B-cell lymphoma after 2 or more lines of systemic therapy, where 51% of the patients who had no detectable remaining at the median follow-up of 7.9 months, cancer remaining. So that's really important. As you can see, these are extremely efficacious from that standpoint. This is a slide I actually used from Novartis' website, as the reference indicates. And it really, I'm not going to go through all this, but it really covers how the whole process is put together. And I think it's important to understand because as we are discussing precision medicine, where we are trying to really look at personalized medicine, as the other term you may have heard, is that this is going to be a drug for an N of 1, i.e. this is specific for each individual patient, where basically the T cells are being removed from the patients, are being reprogrammed, are going through an expansion, through quality check, and then re-injected into the patient. So we are really talking about really individualized therapy. Another type of individualized therapy that was launched very recently, actually in December 2017, is Luxturna, which is a novel gene therapy. It is the first and only pharmacologic treatment for an inherited retinal disease, blindness actually, and first adeno-associated virus vector gene therapy approved in the US. As you can read from the quote, this is something that also is going to expand our precision and personalized medicine in bringing to patients potential cures of genetic diseases. And as you can see from the quote, I believe gene therapy will become a mainstay in treating and maybe curing many of our most devastating and intractable illness, said FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb in the press release that is attached in the reference. Other technologies that are going to disrupt genetic diseases is what you may have heard as CRISPR-Cas9. CRISPR stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short palindromic repeats. Okay, basically what is this? It's an enzyme that can cut DNA, okay? So that's what you are looking at, and there is, if you do a Google search on this, you can have actually look at some videos, how this works greatly. MIT has a fantastic video on that. They were one of the founder, as well as UC Berkeley, of CRISPR-9. CRISPR Therapeutics has submitted the first clinical trial application for CRISPR gene editing therapy, and this is something that is ongoing right now. So this will be an area that's going to be very, very interesting to look at, and potentially will be very transformative in terms of reprogramming the DNA of patients when there is anomalies. With that, now let's talk about marketing and some of the key issues, as I mentioned to you earlier, that you're probably very familiar with, which is pricing. And I'm just going to concentrate on pricing of pharmaceutical, because we don't have time to talk about healthcare pricing, which is, some other issues which are also critically important. First of all, if you look at the worldwide sales of prescription drug, not OTC, not over-the-counter, they have been growing quite substantially, and they've been growing both in generic as well as orphan diseases. Orphan diseases is the light blue that you can see, and as well as basically novel drugs. And you can see the number of novel drugs have increased actually substantially over the years, meaning that R&D productivity has been actually pretty decent. One of the things that has been a really big issue has been pricing. And I am here giving you a couple of examples of some of the drugs that have been priced in, between $375,000 all the way to almost close to $1 million for some of these drugs. And one could ask, why are they so expensive? For drugs that I would say are manufactured and are not personalized, in the sense that of the two type of drugs I just showed you recently, i.e. CAR T cells or cells that are gene therapy, one could argue that for these, maybe these therapies are specifically manufactured for each individual patient, and therefore, because the process is so cumbersome and so task and people demanding, that may explain the price. The other issue might be the fact that the number of patients are very small if they are for orphan diseases, and that pharmaceutical companies need to recoup their costs. This is an issue I don't think we'll have a lot of time to discuss in great depth, but this is something that is going to be evaluated very carefully by not only the insurance companies, the administration, but for example, another thing that I should mention is that in any country, in any markets outside of the US, pricing is actually regulated by the governments, whereas in the US, it's basically the pharmaceutical companies that decide how much they want to charge, and then they have to negotiate with the payers, either insurance companies or sometimes employers. And we'll talk about that a bit later. Another thing that is happening, which a number of insurance companies and big employers are demanding, are outcome-based pricing. Outcome-based pricing are basically something that is fairly new. Novartis announced that it's collaborating with Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services on a unique pricing model. And what they are saying is that if children and young adult patients with ALL, don't respond to Kymriah, by the end of the first month after treatment, Novartis will not be reimbursed. So that's something that's quite important. And Novartis is willing to say, look, we are actually producing a drug that is going to be effective. If it's not working for that patient, then you don't have to pay us. That is very, very interesting and going to be watched by a number of companies, including the managed care organizations as well as Medicare. Another thing that is important is the fact that a number of the states are trying to have transparency legislation, basically to show complete transparency in terms of pricing as to what manufacturers are charging, what the pharmacy benefit manager are charging as well, to really understand the whole principle of how pricing ends up and what the payers and provider and ultimately the consumer and the patient is having to pay. And that is something that is quite important. So let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen in 2018, and this is kind of me pulling the crystal ball to some extent, but obviously, you know, your crystal ball is as good as mine. But let me give you some of my thinking. There was a study that was done by PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is a consulting firm, to look at the top health industry issues of 2018. Everyone has heard about the opioid addiction. I'm not going to talk about this. Natural disaster, that is something also that is important. Tax reform, health policy shift, that is something that is going to impact tremendously what is happening, as well as cost pressure from that standpoint. And that's going to be quite important as well. If we look at life science trends in 2018, one of the things that we see expanding substantially is the oncology market. It's expected to hit 120 billion by 2020. The treatment complexity is growing exponentially. We are trying to do a lot more precision medicine, where we are trying to do N of 1 for each patient. So that's also going to impact clinical trial design. It's going to impact the commercial model versus, you know, the one-size-fits-all. There's been also a really big shift towards the patients. And from that perspective, we have been shifting from the product to the patients, with technology being the driving force, from the standpoint that now everybody can potentially get full genomic data. And actually for certain disease, especially in oncology, depending on the centers that you go to, you will have a full genome being done and analyzed and tested against all the genes that we know today that are potentially causing cancer. Another thing is that there is a number of bills that have been introduced in pharma pricing in 2017 in a number of states. I assume that a lot of the other states that have not done that yet will do the same thing. The FDA wants to increase biosimilars, again, to increase access to all patients, because biologics are very expensive. They actually are the top 10 drug in the US today, and actually worldwide from that perspective. So we have shifted from small molecule to biologics. And we will see a lot more individualized treatment based on variant level of gene therapy. Another thing that is happening, and some of you have seen this as well, and I think that's going to have some major impact, is that the tech companies are looking at healthcare business and realize that there is a lot of inefficiencies. For example, Amazon has received wholesale pharmacy licenses in a lot of states already in 2017 and is expanding in 2018. If you look at what Amazon has done in a lot of sectors, especially, for example, with books, now moving in the grocery business and in a number of other areas, they have really transformed the way consumers are getting access to products and goods. Well, to some extent, you know, a drug is a product that you are buying. And yes, your insurance is going to pay for part of it, but you also have copay. I think Amazon is going to make some potential major changes there. They are going to be also potentially increasing the efficiency of how drugs are coming from the manufacturers directly to the patient. As a matter of fact, Berkshire Hathaway, Amazon, and JP Morgan announced that they were teaming up to form an independent healthcare company for all of their employees in the US. That is going to also have a major impact. In other market disruption from tech companies, Apple, for example, did a heart study with the Apple Watch, where they collaborated with Stanford for patients who had atrial fibrillation, where they were using the Apple to basically heart monitor 24/7 through the EKG that was linked, and then referred to the physicians to see if there were any anomaly. Alphabet, which is basically the parent company for Google, Calico Drug Development, is focused primarily on longevity, as well as also looking at big data to try to improve healthcare overall. So they are hiring heavily from life sciences. Finally, IBM, and there's a number of other companies that are entering that space, is using Watson and working with artificial intelligence. Actually, many of these companies are doing the same thing. But IBM has done a lot of collaborations with many academic centers, including UCSD for that matter, for drug discovery, optimizing treatment, and managed care. With that, I will turn over the presentation to Dr. Hirsch, and we'll soon be able to entertain questions. Jan?
Thanks, Williams. We appreciate that great presentation. We will entertain some questions in just a moment. We just wanted to give you an update on the MS program. There have been a few changes, good changes. First one is that we have recently reduced the curriculum to be 5 quarters only. So it had been 6 quarters, but now it is 5 quarters. And a related good news is that does reduce the tuition. So if you have down to $52,000. So if you have old information or flyers that say something different, I just want to make sure that everybody's aware that this change has occurred, and it is on the website correctly now. The classes are going to be from Tuesday to Thursday, and they're going to be in the late afternoon from 4 to 8 p.m. on UCSD, our SCAD School of Pharmacy campus. And so what that allows is for a class that will contain students that are working, which is great, but then they can sort of take off early in the afternoon and attend class. We are targeting and taking applications now for the first class, which will start in September of this year, September 2018. It is an online application, and if you just, the link is here. We do not require a GRE, GMAT, but we obviously look at GPA, and all of the requirements are on the our website. And for more information, and there are a couple videos with some more information and information sessions we've given in other settings on the program link there, ddpm@ucsd.edu.